Some Dubious Premises in Research and Theory on Racial Differences, by Marvin Zuckerman, 1990. Part 2. Genetic Diversity. The data on personality suggest that the variation within broad populations, such as those defining the three major races, is large, relative to the variations between these populations. New methods enable us to examine genotypical as well as phenotypical variation. Protein variation between human populations is small relative to the variation among individuals within populations. Latter, 1980, analyzed 18 genetic systems, blood groups, serum proteins, and enzymes, in 40 populations within 16 regional subgroups around the world. Using a multivariate measure of individual differences, he calculated the variability within and between populations, breaking down the population variance into geographic regions and racial groups. The major component of genetic diversity is between individuals in the same tribe or nation. It accounts for 84% of the variance. Of the remaining variance, 10% is accounted for by racial groupings and 6% by geographical regions. Similar conclusions were reached for sequencing of mitochondrial and nuclear DNA for human populations, Kin et al., 1987, Wainscott et al., 1986. When interpopulation distances are corrected for intrapopulation variation, they become quite small, amounting to 14% of the mean within population variation. The genetic analyses support the phenotypical analyses of personality. Racial groups are much more alike than they are different. Crime and antisocial personality. Racial differences in American crime rates and patterns of sexual behavior have also been cited as evidence of inherited racial patterns of socialization or antisocial tendencies, Ellis, 1988a, 1988b. Most of these high rates of crime for blacks represent young adolescent and adult males living in inner-city ghettos. Twin studies indicate that although adult criminality shows evidence of heritability in the concordance ratio of identical to fraternal twins, juvenile delinquency shows little evidence of heritability, with fraternal twin concordance rates nearly as high as those for identical twins. Christensen, 1977. Although most chronic adult criminals have a record of teenage and earlier delinquency, most teenage delinquents do not go on to become adult criminals. Wolfgang, Figlio, and Selin, 1972. The twin concordance rates in studies conducted between 1931 and 1961 indicated a somewhat stronger genetic pattern for adult criminality, with concordance rates of about 69% for identical and 33% for fraternal twins. However, the results from later Scandinavian studies, Christensen, 1977, Dalgaard and Kringlen, 1976, have shown much lower rates for identical twins, about 33%, and fraternal twins, about 16%. Stronger evidence for genetic rather than shared environment influence on criminality comes from a study by Mednick, Gabrielli, and Hutchings, 1986. Using data from adoption studies in Denmark, these investigators found that criminality in the biological parents of adoptees was related to criminality in the adoptees, whereas the official records of the adoptive parents were not predictive of crime in their adoptive children. But they also found that the socioeconomic class of the adoptive parents was related to the incidence of crime in adoptees even after correcting for the class of the biological parents. If this is true, it would show the narrow range of social class differences found in Denmark. It is likely to be even truer for the wider ranges within the United States and the United Kingdom. The results from Swedish adoptees also showed a strong influence of postnatal environment on crime, Cloninger and Gottesman, 1987. Risk of criminality in their sample was not increased unless both the congenital and postnatal factors were predisposing. The recent tendency to account for racial differences in arrests and convictions by biological factors alone ignores the demonstrated influence of drugs and general family disruption in lower-class black communities. If we turn to studies of diagnosed antisocial personality rather than crime statistics, there is no evidence of racial differences. A major study of the prevalence of psychiatric disorders in the general community was undertaken by the National Institute of Mental Health in the United States. Robbins et al., 1984, interviewed about 2,700 blacks and 6,900 whites randomly sampled from census tracts in 3 U.S. cities. There were no significant racial differences in diagnoses of antisocial personality in any of the cities, and in 2 of the cities the rates were slightly higher for whites than for blacks. Thus, when random sampling is used, there is no evidence supporting the idea that blacks as a group in the larger American community have a greater disposition to antisocial personality disorders than do whites. The contrast with the crime rate statistics is illuminated by the high rates of environmentally produced delinquency in poverty-stricken environments. Robbins, 1978, found that adult criminality is more related to socioeconomic class of origin in blacks than in whites. Cloninger, Reich, and Guez, 1975, reported that their data showed no genetic differences in sociopathy between blacks and whites. One would expect behavior geneticists, psychologists interested in racial differences to use the data from their own disciplines, particularly those data derived from proper sampling methods, rather than the crude population statistics, uncorrected for social class and other variables, from the World Almanac. Reflections on Racist Science and Responsibilities of Scientists. The word racism is often used in a pejorative sense. According to Webster's Third New International Dictionary of the English Language, unabridged, 1981, racism is the assumption that psychocultural traits and capacities are determined by biological race and that races differ decisively from one another, which is usually coupled with a belief in the inherent superiority of a particular race and its right to domination over others. p. 1870. Note that the definition consists of 2 parts. The first is the ideology, and the second is the application of the ideology. Some researchers on race seem dedicated to establishing the racist ideology on a scientific basis while denying the political beliefs that are associated with it. Now, scientists are not likely to make the distinction between scientific theory and what seems to be its political implications, or between generalizations based on population statistics and their applications to individual members of a given group. In terms of the possibilities for social change, most would equate inherited with unchangeable. I have been accused by colleagues of bringing moral values to bear on purely scientific questions. These colleagues describe themselves as liberal in belief and absolutely opposed to racism as a political doctrine. I share with them the belief that all questions should be open to scientific investigation if they are answerable by current scientific methods. I have raised questions about the likelihood of finding the role of genetic mechanisms in racial differences, using prevalent definitions of race. For the sake of argument, let us suppose that these questions are answerable. Is this an important scientific question, worth the harm it might do in fostering and reinforcing stereotypes that are applied to individuals in the broader society? Harrington, in Press, has challenged the assumption of a value-free science that is above criticism related to topic. Is anything studied by the methods of science beyond challenge on moral grounds? Everyone agrees that the scientific studies of survival time in freezing water conducted by the Nazis on concentration camp inmates were immoral, regardless of the quality of the methodology and data. But we do not agree on the reprehensibility of theories that reinforce negative stereotypes of large segments of the human population and thereby foster racism in all of its more malignant aspects. Of course, one should not criticize the study of nuclear physics because of possible extrapolations to hydrogen bombs. However, a scientist who decides to work on the interesting problem of developing a small portable hydrogen bomb is not above criticism. Similarly, research on the genetic and biological basis of intelligence should not be criticized because someone might make unwarranted racist extrapolations from the findings. Generalizations about the innate intelligence or social responsibility of large and genetically diverse segments of the species are open to criticism on the grounds that they serve no important scientific purpose, given the present ambiguities in definition of the independent variable and immense sampling problems. A more important task is to discover the biological and social basis of individual differences in personality and intelligence within populations. Questions of population differences could be better addressed after we understand the proximate biological basis of the phenomena and can provide a better biological definition of the populations now called races. There are a number of legitimate rights of investigators to study these problems now and to attempt to form some hypotheses. Misguided attempts at censorship to elicit protective reactions from the academic community may lead some academics to suspend critical judgment of the work and reasoning of the person under public censure. However, there is a general responsibility of scientists to avoid selectivity of data and selectivity of data reviews, to consider the sampling and controls required for hypotheses to be tested, to evaluate the adequacy of data sources and methods, and to give more than perfunctory consideration to alternative hypotheses. These are responsibilities of scientists in any area of science, but in socially sensitive areas they are of even greater importance. How a scientist behaves after a discovery is also a matter of social concern. The expected course of behavior is to publish in scientific journals and consider the reactions of peers before appearing on talk shows to present one's viewpoint to the general public. There are proper forums for scientists to present findings to the public, and there is nothing wrong with this as long as investigators are cautious and qualifying in their conclusions. However, television does not like complicated and qualified ideas. Most popular programs in this medium serve an audience that seems to want simplicity and sensation. They are not good vehicles for informing the public of complicated scientific issues that lend themselves to distortion by those with political axes to grind. Eysenck, in Press, has acknowledged the danger of misinterpretations of research to serve racist purposes, but he suggests that these dangers are less than those of censoring in science. This assumes of course that the basic research is unbiased and non-selective. Critical peer review is not censorship. Scientists also have a social responsibility to be extra critical on research or theory that serves racism. Rushton, in Press, has claimed that criticisms of his research for research on evolutionary and genetic hypotheses concerning race are held to ludicrously high levels. One must read the critiques of his work to decide whether his critics are unreasonable in their demands for standards of proof and deduction. Lynn, 1989, Zuckerman and Brody, 1988. However, as Rushton's work on race has been published in respectable journals, there is obviously some disagreement about the standards or the work. But why shouldn't one impose high standards for those interpretations that have such large potential for abuse and social or physical harm? When the tobacco companies or their paid investigators report that cigarettes are safe, one should scrutinize their evidence with great care, not only because of the questionable objectivity of the findings, but also because of the harm to smokers if they really believe the findings, and the findings are false. The question of whether ideas are based on good or bad science, scholarship, and logic is not an irrelevant question. The question of whether racial studies are racist largely depends on the quality of the research and the reasonableness of the deductions. The lay public is often unable to make these distinctions and is prone to accept anything coming from a person in a white lab coat as fact. While defending the academic freedom of scientists to pursue research, we should make our disagreements and the reasons for the disagreement quite clear. Emotional reactions unsupported by reasons are useless because they undermine our credibility as scientists. If we fail to express our disagreement with practitioners of racist science, their pronouncements will be accepted by the public as the pronouncements of science. All questions should be open to scientific investigation if they are answerable by current methods. All questions of race should be open to investigation of reasonable hypotheses based on sound data. However, certain topics are regarded with justified skepticism because the premises on which they are based are either not scientifically justifiable or are basically untestable using the scientific approach. If an investigator claims to have irrefutable scientific evidence for astrology, conscious life after death, the existence of God, or the content of the unconscious life of pre-verbal infants, it is quite natural for scientists to regard such claims with skepticism and disbelief. When the evidence is found to be deliberate fraud, the fault is usually the lack of proper controls in the research, lack of attention to alternate, more parsimonious interpretations, and unwarranted generalizations from the data. In medical science, the consequences of bad research can be a matter of life or death. In psychology, the harm done by bad science is usually of little consequence. However, when the fallacious ideas generated are used to support pernicious political doctrines like racism, the results are a disservice to our science and, more important, to the larger human community.